This is frankly preposterous. Something should be done. Take a note. Lexi are not like this. This is boisterous and somewhat overt, very, very noisy, blisteringly quick, and the easiest way to draw a straight line between the boss's secretary and the Palazzo Versace. So yeah, I'm kind of loving it. I'm John Cadogan from autoexpert.com.au, the place where Australian new car buyers save thousands off their next new cars. Hit me up on the website for that. Now, at the risk of sounding like your digital pimp, do you want to see some proper engineering porn? I must confess, a week or so ago, before picking up this fine automobile, I had not yet considered the full pornographic potential of the mighty strut tower, but I ask you, are you not besotted? Is this not a thing of beauty? The Ron Jeremy of strut towers, the Rembrandt of strut towers, carved by hand by Takumi ninjas from unobtainium alloy. Always wanted some of that. When I take over the world and move into Dr. Evil's office, of course, I'm going to get a big fat stack of these and park them just to the left of the trapdoor over the shark tank. It seems appropriate somehow. The engine's okay too. Perhaps we should go for a drive then. Ever get the chance to drive an LC, my strong advice to you is head straight for the nearest tunnel, crank down the windows and give it a squirt, because it is a real aural rush, all right? There are 3 drive modes in this car. You access them on a little rotary switch just up here. There's dominatrix, Sade and Gitmo. So do it in Gitmo for the full auditory rush. Lexus actually calls those modes Comfort, counterintuitively, Sport, and Sport Plus. I'm pretty sure they had a meeting about that, but I still think my descriptions are better. This car feels just like a Mustang or a Camaro would if only Ford and General Motors allowed their engineers to play the game of R&D like they really mean it. There's such a high degree of body integrity with this vehicle. You feel it every time you drive. And I have no doubt that in 100, 150,000 Ks of sometimes quite severe driving, that the feeling is going to be exactly the same, because squeaks and rattles and random stuff just falling off in the cabin, that would be such a big no-no back at head office strut tower ninja carving central at Motor Mackie. Of course, let us not forget the LC500 is twice the price of the Aussie converted right-hand drive Camaro and 3 times the price of a Mustang GT. So there's that to consider. They are emphatically not direct financial competitors. But when you think about it, they are all members of the same threatened species. The rear drive big fat Atmo V8 club. Yes. And hey, I know it's heresy to use the word Lexus in the same sentence as Mustang or Camaro or muscle cars generally. I know Lexus does not have the same tire shredding pedigree as the other pair, but there's really no arguing the fact that this vehicle is built so much better. In fact, I'll have a proper engineering assessment, meaning a beer garden physics analysis of just one aspect of that engineering superiority a little later in this report. The drive is, well, it's a precision high-performance device, so in that context, it's a luxury 2+2. But if you want luxury first and everything else second, then this is not the car for you. So you might be thinking, well, what do I expect when I drive a car like this? Is it luxurious or what? I mean, it's a Lexus. So I'd suggest that in the context of what this car is designed to do, which is that ultra high performance sort of driving, then yeah, it is quite luxurious. But in the context of luxury cars broadly, it's right up the harsh end of the spectrum. And should you reach up here and engage Sport Plus, then the vehicle will channel its own Paris Island US Marine Corps drill sergeant quite a bit. And I kind of like that, because if you want to do that kind of driving, that's what you need on your side. The primary driving ergonomics are sensational. The wheel is really nice to use, and the cockpit generally and the seats give you a great deal of lateral restraint. Now, this is important and often overlooked by many drivers, because in that high performance context, tipping a car hard into a bend at 80 k's an hour, you don't want to spend too much time or effort or many of your cognitive resources keeping your head upright. And that is so important in performance driving, because this finely tuned 3-axis accelerometer in your inner ear, if you tilt that, trying to keep yourself upright in a bend, it really does skew your perception of the outside world at the worst possible time. And in this car, you don't have to worry about any of that. This car is built on the GAL platform. It stands for Global Architecture Luxury. Lexus says it has the highest torsional stiffness of any Lexus ever made. And it certainly feels that way too. Unlike a proper muscle car, this thing loves tipping itself into a bend. It is gagging to change direction. The weight distribution is nearly perfect, 54-46 I think, and that's pretty difficult to achieve when you've got a thumping big V8 right up the pointy end. So, small round of applause there, Lexus engineers. The polar moment of inertia is quite low in the context of cars, and you can tell that every time the car is just very happy to pivot around that vertical axis in the plane of yaw. And you'd want this vehicle in particular to do that, because it's fitted with the $15,000 handling enhancement pack, which includes the carbon fibre roof upstairs to reduce the mass, and also the 4-wheel steering with variable gear ratio. So if it didn't love cornering, you just have to ask yourself, what went wrong? The 10-speed auto, also brilliant, perfectly integrated with the engine, knows exactly when to shift using what Lexus says is kooky AI logic, which is really not the same thing as proper paperclip maximizer artificial intelligence, thankfully. You might have to look that one up. Google knows everything. It's pretty good at picking what gear to be in any situation, and the spacing between every ratio and those adjacent is equal, and you hardly ever see that. If you are seriously thinking about dropping the big bucks, you just need to be aware of the paradox of owning and driving a car like this. And don't get me wrong, I love it. I'm going to hate giving it back. Impossible not to, okay? But the paradox is that the limits of a car like this are so preposterously high that you are never going to get near them in practice, unless, of course, you crash. I mean, pretty safe to assume you've gotten fairly close to the limit if you manage that. 2 reasons, okay? Number 1, obviously, its limits are insanely high, meaning insanely higher than the driving ability of most people who ever own a car such as this. So how this generally plays out, okay? You'll be driving in your LC 500 one day and you'll be thinking, yes, I'm having a red hot go. And in reality, the car is kind of sitting back here going, really? I'm capable of so much more. And then even if you get the training and you develop the kooky software to exploit the full potential of a car such as this, doing that on a public road is antisocial and dangerous. And let's not forget, it's just a fantastic way to put your license in the shredder. And if that's your objective, there are far cheaper, albeit not as dynamically or orally engaging ways to shred one's license. The question with a car like LC is not, do you need that much performance? Because nobody does. It's, would you find a car with somewhat less performance, more accessible performance, a little more engaging. I've had a couple of fascinating conversations about this, one with Mark Webber and another one with Jensen Button at different times. And they both basically said the same thing, which is that if we all get in a race series, like a ride-on lawnmower race series, you and me and one of those F1 drivers, pretty guaranteed you can drive flat, you know, full throttle all the way around every racetrack on earth in a ride-on lawnmower. And therefore, our times will all be identical, right? And as we step up into more and more high-performance machinery, we might go from ride-on lawnmowers to bomby old Hyundai XLs or something, then it's fair to say that the F1 driver is going to be in front, but the spread between him and us is not going to be that big. But as you step up into more and more exotic performance machinery, the spooky software that they run in their heads makes a real difference, and the spread between us and them increases. And that's kind of where you're at with the LC. So if you think about the friction circle, which you've seen before, no doubt, that's maximum acceleration, maximum braking, maximum right and maximum left cornering on that blue outside line. You can have a combination of those things as well. You can come out here and you can do a bit of right turning and a bit of accelerating at the same time. But if you jump into a bend and accelerate and turn, and the physics means that you would need grip out here, you are going to slide, because this is a hard limit. You cannot step over this line, right? You can brake and turn a little bit left as well. You can do any combination of that, turning and braking and turning and accelerating, as long as you don't step over the line, right? If you're in a somewhat less high performance car, you might step back and go on this dotted orange line like Grandma's Camry or something. It's still got those limits, they're just a little bit less than the LC. And obviously the LC feels a lot different as well, right? But you could measure the difference in the performance. One of the things that's less obvious, though, is what this line looks like when you stick it under a magnifying glass. If you take the blue line from the LC and you stick it under a magnifying glass, it's really narrow. Whereas when you get Mum's Camry or something, Grandma's Camry, and you stick its limit under the magnifying glass, it's a lot fatter. And a few things are really obvious when you think about that. You know, when you take your average commuting car, the kinds that you see thousands of every day on the road, they need a nice wide line like this, because it's nice if a driver gets the message. They're stepping up to the line and the tyres start to squeal and then they start to howl and the car just generally feels a bit uncomfortable, you know. It's sending you a shitload of messages that just say, hey, getting pretty close, you might want to think about just dialing it back a bit. You don't get that so much with a car like the LC. You get this sort of razor's edge between in control and out of control. And that's part of everything. That's part of the whole design setup. The stiffer suspension, the shorter sidewalls on the tyres, they don't give you that feedback. You've got it, you've got it, you've got it, you go harder, you go harder, you go harder, and all of a sudden you step over the line and you're not in control anymore. If you didn't do it intentionally, you are not in control. You can be sliding a car and in control, but if you didn't get the message and you just step over the line, you're out of control because you didn't intend to do that. So that's why these cars can feel scary fast. It's because they don't give you so many messages when you're about to step over the line into that scary zone. So you might want to think about that. If you've got the cash, the 200 big ones, to spend on a car like the LC, do you also run the spooky software up here that can feel this line, even though the margin of warning is like that? It seems pretty clear to me that part of owning a car like this is about the bragging rights. And for this sort of cash, you know, you could call it 200 grand. So a considerable sum. You could get yourself something like a C63S or an M4 CS or some equivalent shit heap from Volkswagen for rich wankers. Those four rings, the gravitational pull, despite their conduct. Personally, when you consider all of those, I think that German competitors are probably just a little bit more polished than the LC when you look at the granular detail. And all of those Germans are going to be turbocharged with somewhat smaller engines, and their performance pedigree is unquestioned. But they're not going to sound as good, right, because of the Atmo V8 thing. And they're certainly not going to stand out as much in a crowd because the roads here, frankly, are awash with 3-point swastikas, etc. I got so much response to the LC in traffic, from both dudes and dudettes in the street. You park and everyone wants to talk to you. You get out on the street in Shitsville in an LC and a lot of people are going to bail you up and ask words to the effect of, "Mate, what the hell is that?" People just want to know. And not just car people. It's got a bit of Batmobile about it, this car. Frankly, the LC is going to be quite the effective ruse if your objective is to chat up hotties. Almost as good as a friggin' puppy. A lot more expensive, certainly, but far less likely to take a dump on the bed in the morning, I'd suggest. This is actually one of the most hilarious parts about reviewing cars, for me at least, expensive cars. By default, people expect you to be the owner when you get out of a car like that, and they make these hilarious, spontaneous judgments about one's socio-economic status. You have a bit of a conversation, and then they discover that you are just another working stiff. And watching their attitude go through these gymnastics is frankly fascinating and somewhat uplifting. Anyway, that's generally. However, when you discover that the puppy would have been the better ploy, depending on your underlying objective. For more on this, visit my other website, puppypickuplines.com. Anyway, right, the LC passes the hottie magnet test. That's pretty clear and quite important to a certain class of owner, I think you'd agree. I'll have you know I did that test scientifically as well by controlling for my own inherent underlying raw sex appeal. That's quite difficult. There's also this question about the engine, all right? We're back in objective terrain now. It's got a big Atmo V8, and that is certainly swimming against the downsizing and turbocharging tide. So, you got to ask yourself, does Lexus have the runs on the board with an engine like that? How does a 5-litre LC500 compare with the somewhat more accessible rear-drive Atmo V8s from the Retardistani Big 3? That's a comparison that's worth doing, and thankfully there is an objective engineering hack for sorting that out. How about we all pretend that we are proper engineering R&D propeller heads all sitting here together in Dilbert's cubicle, braiding our hair and singing Kumbaya and worrying about how we're going to get our baby, our engine, from power output A to power output B, because the marketing department tells us that's quite critical if we want to sell more engines and more vehicles and keep our jobs, which I'm sure we all want to do. How do we do that? You got to start by knowing that power equals torque times engine speed. And if you want that equation to work in reality, you just have to convert RPM into radians per second. Otherwise, the numbers are not going to make sense. And you need to use the right numbers for torque. SI units here in Shitsville or, imperial units for torque in Retardistan. They'll all work just fine as long as you convert this baby. Okay, so as long as you know that, you've got 3 main hacks, 3 different ways that you can use to increase the power output. And the first one of those is just more cubic capacity, make the engine slightly bigger and you're going to get slightly more combustion. With each combustion stroke, you're going to get slightly more torque, and that means slightly more power. So that's easy. You could also just do something even easier, which is spin it faster, just spin it 5% faster. Go from 6,000 revs to 6,300 and try and maintain the torque production at the same level. And then your increase in power is going to be proportional to the increase in revs. Same torque, 5% more revs from 6,000 to 6,300 equals 5% more power. And you see car companies doing this all the time when there's a midlife makeover. You know, a particular car gets to halfway along its life, they just spin it a little bit faster, they give it a notional power increase, and it's just something else to crow about in the brochure and at the press conference. But it doesn't really feel like the car is much faster, because it's not, unless you rev it at those higher revs, which people hardly ever do. The third way, which is going to involve spending a fair bit of the company's money, is to boost the thermal efficiency, to convert more of the energy in a particular amount of fuel into usable work at the crankshaft. So when you're looking at all different engines and you want a metric for comparing all of those different engines, who's doing a better job with converting fuel into work, then how do you do that? How do you control for the cheap hacks, more capacity and more revs, and actually just measure the thermal efficiency thing? Well, there's a charming little device you can use that engineers know about. It's called brake mean effective pressure, which is a way to calculate the average pressure that acts on the piston during the power stroke, okay? And it's quite difficult to do that. You know, you got to do all this unit conversion. It's a bit of a pain in the ass, but it tells you exactly that. It takes into account the capacity and the rev hacks. It controls for them and just talks about the breathing. But here in the beer garden, there's an easier way to do that. This is actually one of my favourite hacks for engines, and it's really good for solving beer garden type arguments with your mates about who's doing a better job on engine design and who's not. Bastardised brake mean effective pressure, B squared, MEP. Really simple to calculate. You just get the maximum power, you divide it by the volume of the engine, and then the RPM where the maximum power occurs. If you do this, right, what you're doing essentially is you're taking the power output and then you're controlling for the swept volume of the engine and the RPM. So the first two hacks we just discussed, you're sidelining them and concentrating on thermal efficiency. It's essentially, you know, depending on which units you use, it's essentially kilowatts per litre per 1,000 RPM. That's how I've been calculating it anyway. It's a hack. And if you work out BMEP like a proper engineer, you actually get a pressure, and it can be in whatever units. It can be in kilopascals or bar or atmospheres or millimetres of mercury or PSI, it doesn't matter. It's going to be a proper pressure if you use proper units. But if you do it like this, if you do it the hack, kilowatts per litre per 1,000 RPM, you get a pressure, but it's not in units that we understand. It's in BUs, or bullshit units, okay, just so you know. So if you do this with the LC 500, right, you get your 351 kilowatts, you divide it by your 4.969 litres and your 7.1 thousand RPM where that peak power occurs, you get 9.95 bullshit units, which is uplifting. Particularly when you have a look at how they went at Chrysler and how they went at GM and how they went at Ford, because when you convert all of these data into BUs, you get 9.61 for the Mustang, then you get 9.17 for the Camaro, and you get 8.87 for the 300C. And that's basically where those four engines sit in the domain of how effectively they convert fuel into usable work at the crank when you control for volume and RPM. One caveat I should mention about doing bastardised brake mean effective pressure is that you can't really compare different fuel types, you can't really compare Atmo engines and forced induction engines, because the volume is not the same thing between those two. Forced induction and Atmo, right, not the same thing at all. But it's a useful way just to see either how well the engineers did their job in R&D or how much money they were given to do their job in R&D. And when you come out and you do this calculation with these four rear-wheel drive bent Atmo V8s, you can see that Lexus's engineers actually had the budget that they needed and the smarts that they needed to make the engine perform better in this respect than the Mustang, the Camaro, or the 300C. And that's got to be good for some bragging rights as well, I'd suggest. Just to wrap up quickly here, would I buy the LC? That is a very difficult question for me to answer. After driving the LX 570, the RX and the UX recently, it's quite refreshing for me to see what Lexus can do when it just has a few too many double espressos in R&D and goes out and channels a bit of Sir Richard Branson. They just say, screw it, let's do it, yes! Acknowledging the elephant in the room, which is always dangerous for diplomacy, Lexus's core proposition is pretty simple. Luxury Toyota, and we all know this, right? I'm not saying it like it's a bad thing, not at all. It's a very good thing if you want luxury, reliability, and in particular, world-class customer support. I guess the trade-off is you just don't get that epistemic German cachet. But you don't get thrown to the wolves either if you have a serious problem. So there's that little point of difference. The LC500 is not that luxury Toyota proposition. I mean, not at all. It is a glorious driver's car, just glorious. You smile when you drive this car, when it's not scaring you shitless. And I don't say that very often. I don't use the G word very often in relation to car reviews. But that car is pretty friggin' ninja to throw at a series of engaging bends, I have to say. And you've got to be so good, because it certainly is when you do that. I loved driving it and I friggin' hated giving it back. So that's a bit of an acid test. But I don't actually have $200,000 to drop on a car, and I can't really relate to spending that much money on a vehicle. I mean, I do want the last thing Donald Trump ever sees to be that stack of LC500 strut towers in the corner of Dr. Evil's office right before that trapdoor opens and the white pointers below all get, epic gastric reflux. I want that. A man can dream. But until that happy day, I sometimes need to go and pick up, big bulky stuff from Bunnings or whatever, or have a passenger in row 2, which is just a bit too Gitmo in the LC. It's a bit squeezy back there and not all that practical for transporting, stuff. It's such a niche product, this car. It's super hard even to define the niche. Like, who exactly is in this niche? The core proposition for that sensationally shot television commercial with the yellow LC in it is a rich dude leaving work at well after his kids are in bed and thrashing the shit out of the car in a multi-level car park, probably his multi-level car park, and he's doing it there because getting arrested for blowing the cobwebs out like that on some public road is probably going to be bad for the share price tomorrow morning, whatever, right? That's the niche. None of these propositions in that television commercial portrayal is arrived at by chance, right? It's a carefully calculated marketing pitch that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to shoot and produce. So if you are that dude in that yellow LC, right, then I approve your proposal to buy an LC500, right? You're going to either be an ace driver in tune with a device that is precision engineered just for ace drivers who are rich, or you're just going to be a rich average driver who's, allergic to dog hair and happy to service the requirements of various hotties while remaining blithely unaware that the car is looking and sneering back derisively at you every time you drive home in the dark.